We are going live. Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We have a pretty big house here of individuals, a really big turnout, actually one of the largest so far for our book talk. We're really happy to welcome Dr. Jennifer Denetdale today for our Mellon Fellowship. We are learning from you. And as I've mentioned in the past, these book talks are funded by the Mellon Foundation and Diné College. So we're really grateful for everyone who's come together to help make sure that this event is also being streamed on Facebook Live, as well as for folks who prefer to listen on the radio. This is being also streamed through KXWR, Diné College. So we're really happy that the radio station is as well as streaming this event. My name is Dr. Wendy Grayeyes. I'm currently the Mellon Fellow for Diné College, and I'm helping to promote these events, but really focusing around the topic of land back for the Navajo people. So we have our fourth speaker coming during our winter author series. And I'm really happy that Dr. Jennifer Denetdale agreed to join us and to talk a little bit about her book. But I want to also do an introduction of her background. She's the first ever Diné woman to earn a Ph.D. in history. Dr. Jennifer Nez Denetdale is a strong advocate for indigenous peoples and strives to foster academic excellence in the next generation of students devoted to supporting indigenous nations and their claims to sovereignty. Denetdale is a professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. Her book, Reclaiming Diné History, The Legacies of Navajo Chief Manuelito and Juanita, was published by the University of Arizona Press in 2007 and set the standard for Diné histories and methodologies. She also has a book for young adults called The Long Walk, the Forced Exile of the Navajo, which was published by Chelsea House in 2007. Dr. Denetdale was appointed to the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission as a commissioner by the Navajo Nation Council, and she now serves as the commission's chair. Currently, she's working on several projects, an educational video on Diné perspectives on death, grief, and life with the Navajo Nation Rights Commission. She's planning a Milton Snow photography exhibition in collaboration with the Navajo Nation Museum and its director, Manuelito Wheeler. She was recently awarded a grant from the Navajo Nation to direct the writing and publication of the first ever Diné government textbook for young adults, which I'm really excited about. And she continues to work on a memoir about the death of her mother from cancer and a book manuscript about Milton Snow's photography of Navajo subjects. So I want everybody to give a very warm welcome to Dr. Jennifer Denetdale. So, all right, the floor is yours. You have about an hour, but you just look at that camera, and this is focused on your PowerPoint.
Thank you for that very gracious introduction and for inviting me with President Russell to Diné College. I'm very pleased to be here and to be part of this winter author series. I just feel really honored to be here and to be in this really beautiful, beautiful place on Diné. It feels good to be here on this campus and breathe the beautiful, clean air and see the wonderful snow, what's left of it. So yeah, she Jennifer Nez Denetdale and she Logan Shlo Ashi Himpashis Chin Kilachitni Dasha Che Hatathli ni Dasha Nala without a Danestan Shle Tohach that I see that Nasha do Beltitsan the other Ayashinanishna. So it's always good to come home and drive across our land. And this evening, earlier I did a podcast interview with Dr. Grayeyes, and she asked me about the 2007 publication of my book, Reclaiming Diné History. And she has a copy there. You might be familiar with it. You might have seen it. It's got the portraits of my great-great-great-great-grandparents, Askinch Ilhajina Dobetsa, Asante Loge. And that was 2007. That's like 17 years ago. Okay. And so, what have I been doing in 17 years? Because the other two books for young adults that I wrote were also written around 2007 and 2008. So, I haven't really been not doing anything. There are people who write books like one right after the other. And then there are people like me who do most of their work in publications as chapter articles and as journal essays. And so I did bring a few of the books that have my articles in them here, and you can come and look at them after this talk. So I just brought some of them just to let you know that I am a writer and I do a lot of research. And actually, in this publication here, which is called Indian Cities, Histories of Indigenous Urbanization, this is a book, this is a collection of essays about Indigenous people in urban spaces. And I wrote an article that is in here that is about Diné experiences with COVID-19. Okay? And so I'm always writing, and it's taken different forms. So this evening, what I wanted to share with you is just a humanities-based research and practice. You know, one of the questions that Dr. Grayeyes asked me is, what did I see changed since 2007? I went to graduate school and I graduated with a Ph.D. in history from Northern Arizona University. And it took me 10 years from the time I defended my dissertation in 1999 to 2007. It took me 10 years to get the research, the writing into shape and acceptable for publication. And so I'm not a fast writer. And I've spent lots and lots of times in archives because I'm a historian. But I'm also a historian who refuses the canon of history, because history departments can be very conservative, conventional places, you know. And so I start out always by refusals and raising questions and saying that's not our history and you don't know what you're talking about, okay? And so that's been my history. And so as I said in my interview with Dr. Grayeyes, the deconstruction, the taking apart of Western histories that purport to represent Indigenous people or Diné, that's the easiest part of my job. Okay? Doing the oral histories, the lived experiences of our people, that's the hard part. That's the part that's rigorous. That's the part that takes the longest time. Okay? And so it's always a journey. I'm 65 years old. I wake up most of the time, unfortunately, at 4 o'clock, sometimes 5 o'clock if I'm lucky. I can't take a nap because my body doesn't allow it most of the time. So I'm always working, you know, and it's a beautiful, wonderful time just to always just be doing all these things that I'm doing and to have people support me in that. So what I want to share with you this evening is just some of the work that I've done since 2007. And I misspelled base because I was working on this at 4 o'clock in the morning. I do know how to spell based, okay, but that was at 4 in the morning. So the writing life is what I wanted to talk about. This picture right here, I do a lot of work with historic photographs. And one of the projects that I'm working on right now is to mount an exhibition of Milton Snow's photographs in collaboration with the Navajo Nation Museum. And two of my consultants, Kenji Kawanho and Ruth Kawanho, are part of my team. They're my consultants. And so this photograph right here is a Milton Snow photograph. The Navajo Nation owns over 5,000 of these snow photographs. Snow was on the Navajo Nation between 1937 and 1957. He took over 12,000 photographs of Navajo people in the aftermath of the livestock reduction, you know. And so people wait think they know something about these photographs. They're familiar. They look like Navajo subjects, but they don't know much about the context of why he was taking these photographs. They're considered documentary. And they don't know much about Milton Snow. And so we bring this exhibition in the spirit of having our people think about livestock reduction and laws and policies and the transformation of Navajo life in the aftermath of livestock reduction. Okay, so I've spent years and years working on this project. So this photograph right here is actually in the National Archives, and the caption on it says Navajo people, something like Navajo people looking to Uncle Sam for a better future. Okay, and so this notion of progress is very much part of Western research practices. In the 30s to the 70s, you would not believe the swarm of researchers that came to study the Navajo problem. Okay, so I'm just going to open with that. The next one. The next slide. Okay, so what is, some of you, you're all, maybe you're humanities scholars, maybe you're in business, maybe you're in engineering, maybe you're taking English or Native Studies or history for an elective. But the place for me where history starts and where research starts is sitting, for example, at the kitchen table, or sitting with young women. This was when I was a graduate student, sitting at lunch with the Navajo women who are clerks in the Navajo Nation offices in Window Rock. Okay? And what people might often call stories, gossip, and rumors actually becomes the basis for research, And a lot of times you're like, what? I can't do that? I'm not supposed to do that? Oh, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, I didn't know that, So you're sitting at the table with a bunch of your relatives, or you're at a conference, and they start talking about all kinds of things. And so this, for me, is the basis of research. That gossip is the basis of research. That actually was one of the basis for my article in this book called Native Historians Write Back. Okay, because when I started, there was just a small group of Native scholars who were doing history in the academy. And so my article in here, which has been published 3 times, let's see, what's the name of it? Chairman, Presidents, and Princesses, the Navajo Nation, Gender, and the Politics of Tradition. Actually, the seeds of that came when I was sitting with Navajo women, having lunch with them in Window Rock, and they started telling me about the patriarchy and about male leadership and where women were in the hierarchy. And that became the basis of that article. It's my most cited essay. Okay, so when you think about research and how it becomes part of your experiences and becomes part of your lived experiences, it really comes from where you're from, your experiences, and talking to your people, and then you start formulating your questions. You never know where your questions are going to take you, or you're just going down all these rabbit holes, and you never know where you're going to end up. When my book was published, The Reclaiming Diné History, this Diné History came to visit me from Navajo Mountain. I was teaching at Northern Arizona University. He brought out this huge map, and on that map of Arizona territory, that includes Arizona and New Mexico, in the mid-19th century, he says, did you know about this? And on that map were all these places where Navajo people had a presence and where Navajo people had been attacked or had attacked people. And then right at where Huelde was on the map, it said it is at this place where Navajo women persuaded their men to not agree to send our people to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. He told me that was part of oral history. And he said, I just wanted to share that with you. That took me down the rabbit hole of finding out about women's leadership at Huelde and after, okay? And so that was just compelling to me, you know. One time they were, you know, during, on June 1st, they do reenactments here on Navajo, different treaty signings. And so this group of Navajo women who had heard about my research came and talked to me, and they asked me about women's leadership at Huelde on the men. And I told them this story. They said, okay, we're going to go back to the committee and we're going to share this story because we want women's leadership and women's involvement in the signing of the treaty and the negotiation, also part of the stories. So I saw them several weeks later and I said, what happened? I said, how did it go? And they said, oh, they didn't believe us. They didn't put it in the reenactment. I was like, okay. They said it's not true because they hadn't seen it published or printed. I was like, okay, I'll go ahead and print it. And I'll go ahead and write it and publish it. And you know what? Today, it's acknowledged the women's leadership roles and that women as the counselors and the advisors to their male leadership had an important role to make sure that our people were not sent to Indian Territory. Because you all would have been Oklahomans. Okay, and so I'm pointing that out to you to talk about the power of your research and the power of the word, however you decide to convey it and to disseminate it. And so those are rabbit holes that you go down. The other rabbit hole that I started talking about leadership led me to gender diversity. Okay, and I started working on that. Okay, so you can go all over the place with this. The next slide. Okay, so I actually talked about this in what I just said about the things of research, formulating your questions, reading. She's Deborah Miranda, who writes one of the first in a creative form, a tribal memoir, takes up California history and the genocide of indigenous people in California. And she says, I still think of that space just before and after dawn as a time when everything seemed possible, when I remember to be grateful for being alive, you know? And so when we do the work that honors our people and honors our ancestors, it always reminds us of how grateful we are to our ancestors for having persevered. Many of our people died, you know? And so that's something that we can't get away from, that the tragedy and the atrocities of what is indigenous history in this country. And the other thing about naming this, some people tell me, you know, you shouldn't talk about that. I think that history is an indictment of the United States. I think that history is about a reminder of their failure to treat indigenous people ethically and responsibly. You know, that's what I think history is about. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so you can't, in the first chapters of my book, one of the things that you have to do, and I think it's better for those of you who are younger and you're coming up the ranks, and I think it's inevitable that you come up against the state of histories and the treatment of indigenous people. It's just there, okay? You can't get away from that, and it's important to name these things, to name these atrocities. In March and April of last year, I was distinguished visiting professor at Carleton College in Minnesota, which is about 30 minutes south of Minneapolis, St. Paul. And I had read the work of Elizabeth Cook Lynn, of the Dakota historian Wezi-Wet'suwet'en, and they talk about the treatment of the Dakota people and the exile of the Dakota people from what is now called Minnesota. They were literally exiled at the point of guns from their homeland. They scattered for thousands of miles after 1862, even into Canada. And today there's only like a few pockets of Dakota, and it's like they were never there. So I went and I rented a car several times and I drove around Minnesota. I went to Mankato where the 38 Dakota men were hung. I went to Fort Snelling, not because I wanted to see the fort, but right below the fort is the concentration camp where the Dakota people were kept for 2 years. Brutal, brutal conditions. And right at that point is their confluence of two rivers. That's a sacred place for them. And now I understand better Dakota history and the writings of Wazia Watawin and Elizabeth Cookman. I'm like fully understand, like you guys, you have every right to be as bitter as you are. I'm going to honor you for that bitterness and thank you for it because you're naming the experiences of our people, okay? But that's not the only thing, okay? And so, you know, one of the things that we don't do enough or that we don't understand enough is the traditions of indigenous resistance, okay? Traditions of indigenous resistance go all the way from the South, the indigenous people in South America, all the way up to Mexico, all the way up to what is the United States and into Canada. And we continue to be the descendants of our warriors who were on the ground, who were part of that resistance. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to remember and to honor those traditions of resistance. What do I mean by traditions of resistance? What does it look like to be a part of traditions of resistance? Okay, and so that's one of the things that I really like to think about and to talk about and to honor our ancestors and our people today for. Okay, in American studies, one of our frameworks is settler violence. You know, we live in a settler state. We live under occupancy of a settler nation like many other indigenous peoples throughout the world. We deal with structures of anti-Indianism, which is Indian hating. And we deal with these disparities. Okay, so that's just one part of illuminating it and naming it, and I think it's really important. You know, but I don't wallow in it. We've got traditions of resistance. We've got wonderful spirits that move past that, and I celebrate that. So the next one. Okay. There's a whole bunch of places that you can go. There's a whole lot of things that you can do. And I think one of the most important things for us as Diné as indigenous people to remember that we are citizens of our respective indigenous nations. Okay, we are not first and foremost citizens of the Navajo of the United States. Okay, we are citizens of a Navajo nation. We have our own sovereignty. At one time, we were a free people. We lived in our own concepts of freedom and liberation. And it's our jobs as scholars and thinkers to think about those moments and that realizing of liberation and freedom. Where do we look for that? How do we realize that? Okay? It's an ongoing job and it's an ongoing process. You know, when they talk about how wonderful democracy is, American forms of democracy, it's actually very anti-indigenous democracy, and that when we perform our own ways of being, our research, our practices of ceremony, our kinship, we are refusing these Western principles of democracy because they undermine us as indigenous people. Democratic principles are about hating indigenous people. Okay, so then you have to think also, well, what does it mean to go back again to our former practices, you know? And so that's kind of like part of my work, and I think about it, and I don't have all the answers, okay? I might not have any answers, but I think these are really important. And the interrogations, the willingness to take a problem and an issue and to look at it without blinking, I think is part of what it means to be a researcher, to have the difficult conversations and to think through problems and issues. Okay, and so you have to do interrogations. Okay, you have to think about these things creatively. Okay, next one. Okay, some of the things that we have to do, I think, I just had a student, she wasn't Diné, who took my graduate seminar this year. And historians are still trained in the Western canon. And I gave her a set of readings where she could take apart what stands for Native histories by a non-Indian historian. And she had never done that before. She had been taught to revere these white historians, you know. I learned myself that they didn't have a whole lot to say to me. Okay, if they don't have a whole lot to say to you, then what do you have to say, or where do you find your place and the knowledge that you need and the education that you need? When you're in these academic spaces, it can be very alienating and isolating, you know, and that's been my experience as well. So right now in the work that we do as academics and as researchers, we look to our own stories, and you're in a place that privileges our own stories. Our creation stories are our history. Our clan origins are our history as a people who came together. How do you build your research based upon kinship, upon caring about each other? Okay, they call it a politics of care too. And so those are the kinds of the questions that I have and the kind of work that I do. I want to share with you a project that I'm working on with the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission. Right before COVID, we were getting conversations and concerns about our people and about our Western practices around funerals. You know, a large percentage of our people rely on border town funeral homes to take care of when the end of life happens. Okay, at one time, we did that ourselves. It's the natural cycle of life. So what we did at the Human Rights Commission was to talk to traditional practitioners and then to do the research. Okay, and I'm the researcher, and I have a policy analyst, Lauren Bernali, who I worked with. And what I found when I was doing the research about funeral homes, we keep the economies of these border towns. They depend on us. They would just go away and die if it wasn't for millions and millions and millions of Navajo dollars floating into these border towns. That goes for funeral homes too. So a funeral can cost anywhere from $3,000 to $16,000 to $20,000. Our people don't have that kind of money, you know? And so we did the report, which is on our Human Rights Commission page. If you go to our Human Rights page and then you look on the link and it has Navajo Funerary Home Report, Navajo Funerary Home, that's where our report is. And one of the things that I did find out when I was doing the research is that the last time there was a full attention or a study on Navajo funerals happened in the 1970s in Los Angeles with a bunch of anthropologists and archaeologists. There were no Navajos there, okay? One of the anthropologists in that collection says, Navajo people have taken up Western funeral services to the point where 500 Navajos will go to a funeral. It's like, in Western society, we don't do that, was what the one anthropologist said, okay? You have a problem, you've formed your questions, okay? You've done the research, you've come up with these conclusions, you know, that we've become people who've been removed from our own end of life cycle, the care of the body. This used to be kin-based. Okay? So that's the easy part of research, okay? Taking apart the Western model, you know, I can do that all day. The second part is, how do you put yourself back together? based on your own principles from the place that you come. So I nominated my vice chair, Steve Darden, for a loose indigenous knowledge fellowship. And he proposed to talk to traditional practitioners and find out from a Navajo perspective about death and grief. Ultimately, we find out that death and grief is about life. And so it was right at the beginning of the pandemic that the Honorable Steve Darden was awarded this Henry Luce Indigenous Fellowship. And so he's meeting with 14 to 16 traditional practitioners, and he's driving. He said he put over 14,000 miles on his brand new truck, and he's meeting people outside of gas stations and stores. And he said there was one traditional practitioner who said, we can't talk about this just anywhere. You have to come to my hogan, and we have to build a fire, and I will tell you these stories. Only 2 allowed him to record the stories, so he had to relegate the stories to his memory. Okay, that's a lot of stories to relegate to your memory. And this is a man whose memory is filled with his ceremonial knowledge. It's incredible. So my point about models for the way forward and the concept of relationality, of how we relate to each other, when that becomes your paradigm, and in this example that I'm giving you, which Stephen has been working on, is that we did have models. We still do have models for the end of life cycle. We do have care for our bodies, and we knew how to do that. Okay, that's not my research to share. That's the Darden's research to share. So last year in December, we did a presentation at the Navajo Nation Museum, and there was a lot of elders in the room. And it was just incredible. It was wonderful. And I could hear them. They approved. They said, yes, we need to talk about this, And Steve said we need to start talking about and refusing dahwiil'aah, because we do have protocols for care for bodies at the end of life. Okay? It's a natural cycle. So at the end, Milton Bluehouse, who teaches here, was in the audience, and he was the first person. I just saw him when I was sitting outside today. He came up and he thanked Darden, my brother, and said, it was really hard taking care of my parents and my mother when she passed away. They kept telling me, you're not supposed to talk about it. He says, you helped me with my grief, And so it was really wonderful. And we go outside after the presentation, and the clouds are gray and billowy. It's December, and there's a light mist. And I said, the holy people approve. Okay, so that's just an example of what you might think about when I do a kinship-based model of research, of how do I start doing this process of returning, for example. It might not happen in my lifetime. Maybe it'll happen in your lifetime, that we stop giving responsibility to funeral homes and we do what our ancestors did ourselves, okay? Because it's important for us to do this ourselves, okay? Because of what I had learned in my education with the Human Rights Commission. My mom passed right before COVID, and my family, we took care of it as much as we could ourselves, And so that's just one thing that I want to share with you about research practices in your communities and with your people. The next one. Okay, so I also do border studies, okay? This is kind of like a new area. Sometimes you guys are going to do really cool stuff and people go, oh my God, I had never heard about that. And then you always want, you're pushing the envelope, you're pushing the boundaries. We all know about border towns. There are our experiences, okay? All the towns are outside of the Navajo Nation for reasons, for historical reasons, okay? And so this is how we're cast in these places. I just drove through Gallup, my most favorite hated border town. I just passed through there. And when you go into these places, they act like you don't belong there. They act like you're an alien in your own land. That's Diné. Winslow is Navajo land. Flagstaff is Navajo land. So go walking through there like you own it, because you do. Okay? And so the research then about the expanse of our territory is really important. I've started thinking about the Navajo Land Claims Commission of the 1950s, in which our land base was considerably shrunken after the decision of the federal government's Land Claims Commission. Do you know what they paid us for the land that they extinguished their title to? They paid us land prices of $18.46 per acre. That's what they paid us. You wonder why I'm always just like bitter. Okay, it's an obscenity, you know? So, but our people don't understand, they don't talk about the Land Claims Commission. And so in 2 years, we're planning a symposium on the Navajo Land Claims Commission. All these ideas, you know, you don't know where you're going to go with them. Okay, so these are some of the things that we deal with in border town studies. Okay, the next one. Oh, the other thing that you guys need to do is put your name on a piece of paper if you haven't done it. Here I am at a protest in Gallup. This was, I can't even remember, maybe it was 10 years ago, a Navajo person who was unsheltered told us that the city of Gallup was planning an anti-panhandling ordinance. This meant that they would encourage consumers who come into Navajo not to give money to panhandlers. They are talking about our people and our relatives on the streets of Gallup. It's mostly who's on the streets. It's also true in Albuquerque, okay? This is a form of discrimination. This is a form of anti-Indian hating. It's not the way to deal with our unsheltered relatives on the streets of Gallup, okay? And so I went there, and they didn't do the anti-panhandling ordinance because I went to their meeting and they weren't expecting me to be at their meeting. Okay? So these are ongoing issues, you know, in these towns where we deal with systemic racism and discrimination. The Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission won a lawsuit, settled a lawsuit with one of the auto dealers, was dealing with the financing in Gallup, and they're no longer in business. Okay, we had to do a lot of networking to bring that about, but it's like trying to put a plug in one hole, and then there's also so many holes. Like, it's just never ending, the treatment of our people in these towns. There's a reason why we don't have a viable infrastructure on our own land. Okay, that's another story. So another slide. Okay, and of course everyone knows. I mean, some of the traditions of resistance, you know, are around our water. This is one where, you know, it had captivated indigenous country at Standing Rock, and this is the Navajo people who were part of showing our concern at the Navajo Nation Parade during that period. Yeah. So we always have a resistance of a tradition of resistance. We learned this from our grandparents and our ancestors. You know, look for those stories. Okay, we see it right here. Okay, next slide. Indigenous liberation and freedom. This is not about inclusion and diversity. Okay, we are a sovereign people. We belong to our own respective nations. We are related to all beings, and our stories are our future. okay? And so that's for me, the basis of my research is that what we do is for the next generations, okay? We might not see it in our time, but maybe our grandchildren will. Okay, so that's always the dream and the vision, that what we do is ethical and responsible to our people and to our nation. You know, Dr. Gray Eyes had asked me about our project on writing the first Navajo Nation government textbook, which is generously funded by the Navajo Nation. We want to hold up our nation, regardless of what we might say about some of the inconsistencies, some of the contradictions, because there's always outside people that would love to see our nations exterminated and dissolved because we're not supposed to be here. Okay, so I always stand for my nation, because we are sovereign. We are sovereign people. And that is always like what I think about when I do my research. Okay, next one. I think I'm almost done here. Okay, so I was telling you about my Milton Snow project. I know this woman she's Pilakana, who was an attorney. She was one of the first attorneys for DNA, and she worked in Tuba City. And she and another woman were working on writing a biography of Milton Snow. And he had left his estate to the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff, and his stuff was just sitting in suitcases on the floor. These are stories by historians all the time. Oh, it was just sitting in a suitcase. So they took it apart and they started filing these photographs and these documents of Milton Snow. So I went to see her and I said, I want to start working and do research on Milton Snow's photographs. The Navajo Nation owns a substantial collection. She passed the files over to me. She said, my friend got too old and said, I can't do this. I'm giving it to you, Martha. And then Martha passed it to me. She said, I'm too old. I can't do this. So I'm hurrying to make sure that I'm not too old and I have to pass it to one of you. Okay? So this is who I'm working on here. Next one. This is what this original state of these photographs look like. He had a van that he drove all over Navajo land from 1937 to 1957. Inside the van was his dark room, and he slept on the top. And so he drove all over the place. And this is the original condition of some of the photographs. He printed them, and then he put them in these envelopes, okay? He had a speech impediment, and he had cerebral palsy. He shook very badly, and he stuttered very badly, okay? So you wonder, how did he produce this incredible number of photographs, So this is the age, I told you, all these people are coming and swarming on Navajo because they want to improve our life and bring us into progress. So he was documenting the benefits of federal programs for Navajo people after they had devastated our economy. They 50% reduction of our livestock. Okay, and in that place, they brought wage labor. They brought migration to border towns. They brought the present government that we have, okay, which is patriarchal. And so in this one, you have Navajo men who are looking at what is a sign for progress, okay? It's probably a windmill, okay, there. Okay, so the next one, I just wanted to show you that. And here's the photograph that I showed you. And when the caption says, Navajo people looking to Uncle Sam for a better future. We're not looking to Uncle Sam for a better future. So you're always refuting what they're saying about you. We're looking to our own people and our own epistemologies for the future. So the next one. Okay. We're doing an educational video with Steve Darden. My filmmaker is Ramona Emerson, who is the author of Shutter. I don't know if you guys have read Shutter. It's the first Navajo horror novel, and it's an amazing novel. And so she's my videographer. I have a grant to do a video with Steve on Navajo perspectives on death, grief, and life. And so we were in Flagstaff, and we recorded him because he can share one story. We have to decide what story he's going to share in 10 minutes because it's an educational video. Okay. And so here's a moment that I took where he's just a wonderful, generous person, you know. He's generous with his knowledge. And so we're working on this. We're at his Hogan in Flagstaff. Okay, next one. Okay. And here we are with my crew at the Navajo Nation Museum as we're getting ready to think about the snow exhibition. We have gallery space. We're going in there, we're measuring, we're talking to Manny, and, you know, and then Clara Kelly. I don't know if you guys know Clara Kelly. She's in her 80s, and she's a walking encyclopedia of the Navajo Nation. You know, she'll start talking, and then she'll stop. She goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, I just went off." And I'm like, "That's okay. I want to hear it," because she can just tell you all. She's literally walked mile by mile, probably the entire Navajo Nation. Okay, she's an incredible resource. So she's on my team, and Ruth and Kenji and Clarinda. Clarinda was a curator of the Navajo Nation, so she's my co-curator. You know, so it's just been fun to work on this. Next one. Okay, and there we are. Next one. Okay, and then I dedicate this. This is my end of my presentation. All the work a lot of the work that I've done has really been because of my mom and dad's care. They met in boarding school, in Sturt Indian School, and they married there. And they thought that it was best that they not teach their children to speak English because that was the boarding school experience. And so they spoke Navajo to each other their whole lives. They spent 60 years together. And they never expected their 5 children to speak our own language, but we heard them speak it every day. And my father was a healer in the Native American church tradition. He was a roadman. So that foundation of having access to books and to reading materials and writing comes from my parents, you know, but it also has the sides of them not taking the time to teach us other things, that the most crucial thing, which is our language. We had ceremonies. They believed in prayer and songs. My father followed medicine men wherever we lived. And so it's to them that I honor them and I remember them. So thank you very much for listening to me. If you have any questions. Oh, okay. While you're thinking of a question, I'm a book lover. Ever since I learned how to read the English language when I was 6 years old, I've had books around me. My father sometimes we didn't have money for some things, but he always had money to give us for the weekly reader, and we could order books. My dad bought dictionaries. He bought encyclopedias. For some reason, he collected Bibles. He read the Bible like 20 times. And so I always had books. And so for me, a gift of a book, to give a gift of a book, to get a gift of a book is always something special to me. And so I want to share that with you. And I am going to ask Dr. Gray Eyes to twirl these around. and to choose one. No looking.
All right.
Read it.
So, L.A. Williams. You get a book.
To L.A. Williams goes this book called
The Red Deal.
The Red Deal. If you want to know how capitalism as a structure affects indigenous people, this is the book that you want to read. Okay? Yes? Yeah.
Pandemic by Yenke, Kiladazaya, a koi bahaneto, Benia, Aje, Benia Hono Kako, Bandanotra, Ashi, Naso at the Bandanotra, Dishi be halts idole.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay.
So my question was just asking about the pandemic and how the research is being done. Will this be in a book in the future? Because it's for our younger generation to know of what we've been through.
Oh.
Yeah.
So our next winner is Irvin Morris. Is that right?
Woo! Irvin Morris.
Is he here? You have to be here. Is Irvin here?
Yeah, he's right here. Come on down, Irvin.
So Irvin gets the story of indigenous people in urban spaces. Okay. Misty et City. This book, called Native Historians Write Back, was compiled by Susan Miller, who is a Seminole historian, and James Writing, and who is Pawnee. Want to sit over here and take a picture? Okay. They published, my essay is in there, and that's my most, I would say that's been published 3 times, and it's my most cited one, and it's a critique of the Navajo Nation and the patriarchy, and a critique of the place of Navajo women in our society, because we are a matrilineal society, okay? And so that's our response to the historians who are non-Indian who write about us. Native historians write back, okay? Now this one, you can see that there's, you want to choose another one? Elena Kenny. Who's Elena Kenny? You see that I read this book because there's tabs in it. You can take those out if you want, okay? So this book has in it my essay about women's leadership. And every time a Navajo woman comes to run for president of the Navajo Nation, you have people who are like, oh my God, the sky is falling. You can't have a Navajo woman as the president of the Navajo Nation. And I'm like, the sky fell in 1863. It's okay, you know? So that essay in there is about, who's the woman who ran? No, the first woman to run for president. Linda Lovejoy. Okay, that's my essay on Linda Lovejoy. So when I'm writing, I'm thinking about the present moment. I'm listening to conversations, and I'm putting them into a research question. And I'm putting it out there for my people to think and interrogate, and to move past those kinds of criticisms, because traditions always change, and women's leadership is our tradition. Okay, so one last book. People will call you, they'll, sorry, Nunabat Rock Bridge. I'll tell you this, I won't lend my books out, but I will give you a book, okay? Okay, so the Journal of Arizona History invited me to write an essay about what I just talked about, research and practice. And so that's one of my latest publications, okay? So that's all the books I have to give out. Thank you.
So it looks like the mic is not on this one. There are a few questions on Facebook Live.
Okay.
And I believe L.A. Williams had one about publications,
Okay.
pandemic itself. The battery doesn't.
Okay.
Hers works.
Mine works.
Okay. So your first question is on Facebook Live. Do you believe historical trauma is buried in our DNA?
I don't know enough about those studies, so I really can't speak to whether or not it's in our DNA. I think that it is in our experiences that moves from generation to generation.
Can you briefly tell us about the process of traditional burials or give us sources on where to look? And that's from Jerry began.
Book Steve Darden.
All right.
Those are not my stories to share. Those are his stories to share. It's really wonderful. It's inspiring and it's enlightening to hear the stories that he has to share. I just did the work to illuminate and open up the spaces about why, about the prevalence of our practices today, which are relying on Western practices. That was my job.
Sweet. We have one from, Dr. Andrea Cristal, who's the Vice President of Research here at Diné College. And she asks, how can Diné College best support historical research?
Oh, you know, indigenous research is interdisciplinary and it really draws upon oral histories and oral interviews. And so I think you guys really, that's one of the strong things that you guys do is to privilege oral history and oral practices. You know, that's what, I think that's really important. I think you guys do that a lot.
Awesome. You're getting quite a few on Facebook Live, but if anybody in the audience wants to ask a question, because you are physically here, I will give you this mic. Aaron Dixon asks, what kind of community engagement can we look forward to with the upcoming symposiums you mentioned regarding land and water treaties and rights?
Oh, well, right now I've really moved into museum work and gallery design, but that's based on the work that I've done around photographs, historic photographs. If you just were interested in historic photographs, for example, of Navajo people, and I tell you that the first photographs of Navajo people were taken in 1866 at Huelte, and then you want to know, well, what's that tradition of taking pictures of indigenous people? What does that mean? What does it look like? And then why am I doing this around Milton Snow? It's actually not really about Milton Snow. It's about the transformations that happen, the re-engineering of Navajo life. Milton Snow doesn't, in any of his photographs, he doesn't show any Navajo resistance to livestock reduction, okay? I found a whole bunch of stuff in the archives in the Newberry Library of Navajo resistance. They sent a sociologist by the name of Solomon Kimball to Navajo so that he could gauge Navajo resistance, so that they could develop strategies to counter Navajo resistance, okay? And so, what was the question?
What kind of community engagement can we look forward to with the upcoming symposiums you mentioned regarding land and water treaties and rights?
Okay, so for this archival project with the Milton Snow, we're convening two panels. The most visible resistance of Navajo people was in the north with Shiprock and Denetdale. And so we're going to talk to some of the people from there who have stories of Navajo resistance. And that's going to be in one of the sections in our gallery. And then what was the other one that I was thinking about? Yeah, those shiprock people have been rowdy for a long, long, long time, you know, and I have the proof for it. And then I said that we had mentioned in 2 years, we're going to do a Navajo Land Claims Commission. We're going to start at University of Arizona and make it a large one. And then I think I talked to Miranda Haskey, who's nodding her head, that we want to do a Diné-based one at Diné College, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, just endless ideas here.
Amazing. Linda Garcia asks, how can we get some of the books that you're presenting today?
Google me and then look on Amazon.
Also, just for Reclaiming Diné History, folks, we do have the QR code here if you do just want to buy it. All right, we have a question in the audience. Here you go.
Yad she de noa jacan joni yazi inisha kilachini nishlin tabahamba shishin but ani dashiche kia ani dashinella akut ego jacan nishlin. Hi, my question was from your research on women leadership. What are the steps that need to be taken in order for a next woman to become the Navajo Nation president?
Oh, you know, honestly, I'm just not that interested in the hierarchy of a structure. I think that we look in other places for women's leadership and that it's here. And then you think about how do you put that into practice, you know. I don't know when that's going to happen, and I don't know. One of the biggest things for me is to look at the 1930s and 40s, that transition in our economy from self-subsistence to dependency, and our migration in search of wage labor and going into border towns is the question of how do we change that structure? How do we bring the economy to the Navajo Nation? How do we create housing? How do we make sure everybody has food? How do we get our people off of the streets? You know, I think those are questions that I think we can deal with as people and as a woman. So I'm really not interested, but I think it's important to critique and to think about. So I don't know if that's much of an answer. So.
So you have another question here from Mardik Benali. He asks, did you face discrimination while in grad school? And do you mind talking a little bit about that?
In my, I was in a master's graduate program in English at Northern Arizona University. I was the only Navajo and Native student in my cohort in my master's program. In my Ph.D. program, I was one of 2 students. The other one was Hopi, and he and I were the only students. And I continue to see that at universities throughout the United States, that it's a very alienating, isolating experience. You're often the only student, the only graduate student in those spaces, you know. And so you learn how to hold space. You learn how to make connections across universities to your communities. And so that's what's happened to me, is that I have a very larger community. I probably know all the indigenous feminists in the United States. I probably can count all of them on both hands. Okay. And so, you know, you create those communities, and it's often not in your programs, it's in other places. And it's been just really inspiring and valuable.
All right. So one of the last questions is from Xavier Begay. What research was the hardest for you and why?
Oh my God. I was talking earlier to Dr. Gray. I was talking to a sheik who's one of my graduate students. He's from Bangladesh. He came here with me about how excruciating hard research is and how hard graduate school is. If I had 30 books to read for a semester, because you're reading 10 books for each semester in addition to articles, I always felt inadequate. So in between semesters and summers, I was reading more books because I always felt inadequate. You know, And so I think that it's always that the work that you do as a student is really, really hard. And you just have to do the work. Okay? I sat Thanksgiving Day writing one chapter of my dissertation. I sat for 16 hours. And my mom brought me turkey dinner on a paper plate. And then years later, my mom says, I know how hard you work. She said, I saw you, she said. My dissertation, I would go, the summer I was writing my dissertation, I went to my professor's office at 6 o'clock in the evening and wrote until 3 or 4 in the morning for 3 months. It was, I can't tell you what it's like. You just have to do it. Yeah. But it doesn't end. The work that you do that you love will always take your heart and take your labor, because that's what you put into it. It's never easy, but it fills you with joy.
Another one popped up while you were speaking, and I think it's an important one. From Kat Yazzie, what are your thoughts on the effects stemming from the relocation programs in the 1970s and 1980s?
That's what we live with today. Yeah. That's why I don't speak our language. That's why my children don't speak our language, because it was intended genocidal policy of the United States to vanish us off as indigenous and Diné people. It's our responsibility, our obligation, and our duty to relearn our language, for example. Okay? It's our duty to go and sit and visit, because you put that much time into research, then we should put the same amount of time into being with our people and with our elders. And I don't do that all the time because we only have so much time. But I will say that me and my sisters and my brother, we took care of our parents until they left us, and I'm very proud of my family that we were there all the way for my parents. I spoon feed my dad and he smiles at me and he says, I never thought you would be doing this. And I said, Daddy, I don't know why. You spoon fed me. And so, that's why I always honor them, because that's what the care is about. That's what kinship building is those relationships. Those are really important.
This will be the last one, right? Okay. First of all, Dr. Denetdale, thank you so much for coming and sharing your evening with all of us here. This is the largest group of students, faculty, staff that has ever actually been in this room. So it's an honor to have you here. I have a couple questions for you. The first one is, one of the reasons we have this Mellon grant in terms of trying to find people to come too. So there's some questions built into the questions. One is, we'll be releasing our next fellowship application, and I wish it'd really be exciting to see what you might be able to come up with in terms of research for a year. So look for that. But the other reason is this whole idea of coming home to the nation's college. That's what we call it. And so one of the things we ask everyone that's come here so far is to say, would you be willing to teach adjunct at Diné College? And so I put that out there. You don't have to answer in front of everybody here, especially if it's no. But I think, that's something that we're trying to bring all the Navajo scholars that are all over the country an opportunity to come home to the nation's college. And so that's something that we ask as part of this Mellon Foundation grant. And that was kind of the impetus of it. The question I have for you is kind of really about all the students that are here. We know one of the hardest things that students going to college and then after college is writing, right? And it's not easy. I think you've shown that, you shared that in terms of, Thanksgiving Day, what you had to go through. I think that's the one lesson all of you know. It's not supposed to be easy. So don't think it is if you're struggling. but what kind of advice might you be able to share with these students about the writing process, if that would be okay?
Just write all the time. Read and write, talk to your people, talk to your relatives, and just do it all of the time. It's never easy. It takes me days to write a proposal. And so I really encourage you to just write all the time. Just write every day. We had a student from HIMAS who was really nervous about writing. He's like, this is not my tradition. And he wanted to major in English and political science because he wanted to go to law school. And I said, you really need a foundation. If you're going to law school, you need a foundation in Native studies. You've got to hit the ground running. You can't do Native Studies 101. And so he changed his major. He double majored in English and Native Studies, you know. And so it's very important for you to have an indigenous studies foundation. You're not walking in there and asking tourist questions, you know. You're ready to go, you know. And our students in Native studies, you here at Diné College, you're ready to hit the ground. You already know the basics, you know. Don't ask those kinds of questions. We've got work to do, you know. Ask the critical questions. That's your job, okay? You already got the foundation. And that's one of the most wonderful things about an education here and education in indigenous studies and Native studies is that you get the foundation of what's important. You don't have to ask 101 questions. So I don't know if I answered your question, President. Okay, thank you. Thank you all.
All right. Well, let's give Dr. Jennifer Denetdale a warm applause and thank you for joining us today. So, one thing I'd like to, go ahead. Yep.
Students, if you haven't signed in, please sign in. Those of you that are students, compliments of the president's office, you'll get a free book because I like the idea of giving books also. So all of you, you'll get a free book of Reclaiming Diné History. So please, if you haven't signed in, please sign in here.
Goes to the Navajo Nation Scholarship Office. Okay, this royalties go to the Navajo Nation Scholarship. This should be the responsibility of every single scholar who gets a Navajo Nation scholarship. They should donate their royalties to the scholarship office for the next generations. That's why I did it.
Yay! And that's very commendable, Dr. Denetdale. Well, we do have surveys, folks, so I am hoping folks online can go ahead and click the QR code. Those surveys do help us get feedback on future speakers or individuals that you want to hear. But I also wanted to announce that our next speaker will be on February 27th. Ethel Branch, she was supposed to be here this month, but we had to make some modifications, but she'll be here February 27th in the same room at the same time as well. But I just also want to give a warm thank you to some of the leadership here at Diné College, particularly Dean Carla Britton, who oversees this wonderful Mellon Fellowship, Provost Alyssa Landry, also President Dr. Charles Russell, as well. And then our IT technology folks, we have Hanson, Jasmine Martinez, and Dylan Nopa, who've really done a fantastic job of supporting us. So I just wanted to give a shout out to everybody, but we hope to see you next month, and all of this will be available on Facebook Live. Thank you, everyone.